guarantees the importance of the media and the access to all the contenders in elections and public opinion and conflict management capacity, particularly electoral management entities, and how to ensure fair and free elections. I think Kevin made a very strong point in terms of the importance of quality of public policy implementation as a next frontier of democracy in the region, and how important it is to improve the capacity to deliver. Otherwise, the citizens will further lose confidence on our institutions and the whole reproduction capacity, the sustainability of the system, it might be at stake. President Lacalle made a very strong point relating the rights of citizens with the capacity as the role of taxpayers and how the relations between citizens and government in terms of fiscal policies. And of course, President Toledo make a good connection between economic, social, and democracy, and that poverty much more than income poverty, the multidimensional measure of poverty, and that answers to the demands of people has to be integral, underlying health and education as a key element, as well as the risk of concentrated our economic growth in commodities and very, very limited number of significant buyers. So finalizing with a reflection about democracy. So thank you all for your attention. So we will move up to the next session, and thank you, the panelists. But we got like 15 minutes. Yeah, but yeah. It was like a good one too. Yeah, well. I wanted to begin on that one.
Sorry. Yeah. Hello? We need everybody to stay outside for 15 minutes so you can go to the claustro or around, because we need to set up this table for the next plenary. So if you don't mind, we really appreciate your collaboration. Thank you very much. It will be only 10 minutes, okay? And we will start the plenary. Thank you very much.
Sono 5 sedie, 2 sgabelli e il podio. Allora 5 più il podio. si alza. después me lo pongo. Después, aspetta.
Uno, due, tre, quattro, cinque, sei. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Prova, prova. Ora, Anto. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. Prova microfono, prova. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. Poi 5, provo il 5, 5, 5, ok. 4, scusa, microfono 4, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, microfono. 2, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 3.
Microphone? Yes, both of us are.
Yeah, both of you. Right. So, and the other one for her.
Sentito della porta neri. Della porta neri. Detto te la porto io. Sì, è che ancora si è visto nessuno, arrivano, si mettono a sedere, tac. Già acceso. Yes. Sì, siamo insieme a fare sta cosa. Ti ho visto, tanti arrivano tutti insieme, si siedono e iniziano. Allora, lì su questa libreria io ho messo due gelati, si dovesse sganciare, insomma, non si sente proprio bravo. A parte che cos'è?
understand that we should have some brief introductory remarks, and I will prefer to stand up here and when I do it. I hope you do the same. Yeah?
You want to start there?
I
Okay.
stand there.
I'm happy.
That's up to all of you. Yeah.
I'm happy to do any. ¿Quién organiza? Frank Barro. Frank estuvo ayer. Está acá. Sí. Sí, sí, sí.
I think I can do it.
Is that higher?
It's not holding well.
No, because you have to take both of the things of the tie.
You're gonna ruin my tie.
No, I would.
I will start.
Good afternoon. We are about to start with this. We are about to start with this panel. Good afternoon, everybody. Before we start, I need to make an announcement. Someone left a bag with an Apple laptop in the MENA room. So whoever left the bag is now in the Club de Madrid office. So a bag with an Apple laptop, a Mac laptop, in the MENA room. Otherwise, we can give it to the best speaker after this presentation. Well, good afternoon. My name is Santiago Canton. I'm the Executive Director of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. And this panel will focus mainly on human rights. And we've been discussing most of the time issues about democracy. Democracy and human rights are very much interrelated, as we already discussed. But we will try in this panel to refer mainly about human rights and the possible decline of human rights throughout the world. We have an excellent group of panelists. Each of them is going to make an initial presentation, 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor for question and answers. In 1948, it was approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was a paradigmatic change for the world. It was, I usually refer to it as the Big Bang of human rights. It started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, unprecedented in the history of mankind. But from then on, 1948 was only the beginning, there was an explosion of human rights treaties, declarations, conventions, rules, and norms throughout the world. And it didn't stop, and it continued to some extent to advance. So sometimes when we speak about the decline of human rights, we need to take into consideration that to many people, it is not in decline, because there is a continuous evolution on the support and defense of human rights. But in addition to the drafting of treaties, conventions of human rights, the states decided, and we should not forget that this is a creation of the states, decided to create a collective mechanism to protect human rights. Of course, at the UN level, we had what used to be called the Human Rights Commission, was the Human Rights Commission, and now is the Human Rights Council. But also in the different regions of the world, started to create different institutions to supervise the situation of human rights. In Europe, in 1953, the European Commission was created, and later the European Court of Human Rights. In the Americas, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights was created in 1959, and later the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. In Africa, in 1986, the African Commission was created. And more recently, in 2009, and we have a member of that group, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission for the Protection of Human Rights was created. So there has been a continuous evolution, and today, in addition to the UN system for the protection of human rights, 147 countries out of the 193 countries of the UN are under some sort of supervision in the protection of human rights. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience now. I'm from Latin America. And in the Inter-American system, we have what is probably one of the best and most advanced human rights systems to protect human rights, or that, at least that's what we believe. Let me tell you a little bit about my experience in that respect. I was Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights during 12 years, until very recently, and before that I was the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression created by the Summit of the Americas in Chile in 1988. Many of the presidents in this room, the presidents from Latin America, I had the opportunity to interact with them as in the capacity as heads of state, and as a representative of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and a special rapporteur, I had to criticize the human rights situation in those countries, and sometimes very harsh criticisms. Most of them, all of them that are in this room, I have to say, did respond in a very strong way, but always within the framework of the Inter-American system for the protection of human rights. They criticized the denunciations and the arguments of the Inter-American system for the protection of human rights, but at the end, they continue the process, they defend the system, and they never attempt to break what for many is one of the best systems for the protection of human rights in the inter-American system. And that's the way it should be. I mean, the inter-American system denouncing and advancing human rights, and states defending their position. But lately, some things have changed, at least in the inter-American system, and I believe in other systems as well. When the Inter-American Commission denounced violation of human rights in Venezuela, rather than responding within the framework of the norms of the inter-American system, President Chavez decided to go publicly on TV, denouncing the commission, denouncing the executive secretary of the commission, saying that the executive secretary, myself, was pure excrement. I don't know whether that's a compliment or not. And then withdrew from the inter-American system for human rights. Venezuela, about a year ago, withdrew from the inter-American system. Brazil, more lately, after the Commission denounced human rights violations against indigenous people in the construction of a hydroelectric dam in Brazil, withdrew the ambassador of Brazil to the OAS and started a process of, they refer as a process of strengthening the inter-American system, but in truth is a process of weakening the inter-American system for the protection of human rights. Ecuador is another country that is no longer participating, and there are other countries right now that are also looking into either withdrawing from the inter-American system or changing the rules of the inter-American system. But the inter-American system is not the only one. The UK, the government in power in the UK, the Tories, announced only a couple of weeks ago that they may withdraw from the European system for the protection of human rights. If the parliament in the UK doesn't pass a law that will allow the government to veto the decision of the European Court of Human Rights, the Tories want to withdraw from the European system of human rights. The African system, which was created in 1986, it's evolving slowly, but it's really far, very far from being a system that can really defend and protect human rights in Africa. And the Asian system, I just came from a meeting in Bangkok with Rafendi, was created in 2009, and I hope we can hear from Rafendi, is having a lot of trouble really to protect and defend human rights in Southeast Asian countries. In addition to that, the balance of power, as we have discussed over the last couple of days, the balance of power is shifting in the world. It's moving from west, slowly but steadily from west to east and from north to south. But many of the emerging countries, emerging democracies or emerging economic powers, do not have human rights as a priority in their own agendas. Let's take a look at the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Human rights is not the priority. The last meeting of the BRICS in Fortaleza, Brazil, in July of this year, human rights, civil society from the south, tried to have the final resolution, including very concrete aspects to defend human rights by the BRICS countries, and it was completely unsuccessful. So for them, it's not the priority. And for those countries that human rights was somewhat, not always, but somewhat the priority from Europe and the US and Canada, seems also that human rights, at least since 2001, is not number one priority. Until recently, you may all remember, the US put in doubt the absolute prohibition of torture. Many countries from Europe participated in the extraordinary renditions that supporting the torture of many individuals in the war against terrorism. So and approximately 54 countries participated in those extraordinary renditions. So the collective defense of human rights seems not to be working. I mean, that's a reality. And yesterday, at least in the working group that we had on the Americas, I believe that at least a couple of presidents mentioned that when they saw the advance of human rights violations in some of the countries in the region, particularly in Venezuela over the last couple of days, they didn't do anything. They knew it was happening, but they couldn't do anything. So the idea that was the idea back in 1948, that the states will come together to defend human rights, same with democracy. I mean, at least in the inter-American system, another system, there is an inter-American charter to defend democracy, but seems not to be working, at least not to be working the way it was initially conceived. So that's the starting point for the discussion. I'm going to ask each of the panel. We have a great group of speakers. Let me introduce them now. One of the great things of this panel is that we have 4 different regions: Latin America, Asia, Europe, and Africa, and 4 different backgrounds. We have an academic, we have a practitioner of the intergovernmental system, we have the former Prime Minister of Norway, and we have a successful businessman and philanthropist. So let me introduce them now, and then we'll ask each of them to make an initial presentation. You can do it from your chair, or you can do it from here. On the right side, Hector Chamis. He's from Argentina. He's a professor at the Georgetown University Center for Latin American Studies and in the Democracy and Governance program, and he's a prolific author. He has published books and many articles, and he has a weekly column in El País de Madrid. Rafendi Jamin, he's from Indonesia. He's one of the founders and the chair of the, he was the founder of an organization in Indonesia and the executive director of the Human Rights Working Group. And since the beginning of the Southeast Asian System for the Protection of Human Rights, he has been a member. He's in, right now, he's in his last year as a member of the ASEAN Human Rights Intergovernmental Organization for Human Rights, and he has been there from the beginnings. He knows the history of the system, and he knows what are all the challenges to strengthen that system. Kjell Magne Bondevik, Mr. Bondevik, former Prime Minister Bondevik, Prime Minister of Norway. But in addition to that, and all of us working in the human rights field know that he has been an active defender of human rights throughout the world, not only in his country. And a member, Mr. Bondevik, a member of the Club de Madrid. And Mo Ibrahim. Mo Ibrahim is the founder and chair of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, established in 2006 to support good governance and exceptional leadership on the African, and has an exceptional leadership in the African continent. He's a distinguished businessman and a philanthropist. So with that introduction, I will first ask Hector to make a presentation. Again, Hector, you can do it from your chair if you want to come over here. And then we will open the floor for question and answers.
Okay. Thank you, Santiago. I'm not here, actually, as you can see. So Santiago has me as there is the figure of the ghost writer. Well, he just invented the figure of the ghost speaker as well. No, it's good to be here. I've been, of course, as a Latin American and as an academic, as a writer, I've been paying attention to some of the things Santiago was mentioning. For my column in El País, particularly the Venezuela situation, of course. But let me start with a sort of a little, first with my more academic hat, if you want. 1948. And interestingly enough, 1948 relaxes, or if not suspends, time and space with regards to human rights. And it needs to do so to be able to generate the human rights agenda and enforce. Time and space because we get to realize that, well, World War II, the Holocaust, and all these horrors, 1948 means, well, we didn't have the instruments to intervene. Had we been able to intervene, we would have avoided at least some of the tragedies of World War II at the time. And it relaxes, therefore, space, sovereignty. It redefines, it suspends some fundamental aspects of sovereignty. Universal jurisdiction has to be on top of the list if we are about to speak about human rights and enforce human rights. The second one is time. Human rights violations are crimes that do not prescribe. And here we go, second half of the 20th century with this agenda. Redefining some of these issues and trying to generate institutions and the instruments that are capable of intervening if it's universal jurisdiction and there is no prescription. Take that discussion to Latin America, it didn't get there. to Latin America. The issue didn't get to Latin America until the 70s. And largely because there was a paradigmatic shift for us in Latin America having to do with the Carter administration in the US. The Carter administration, the Undersecretary Patricia Dirian, a very well-known figure all over Latin America, under the most brutal authoritarian regimes at the time that the region had seen, meant a paradigm shift in the sense that the Carter administration put human rights on top of the agenda. And with that way, under severe human rights violations in most of the Southern Cone and other parts of Latin America, it entailed a paradigm shift for, I would say, interestingly enough, the dissidents, the left in Latin America, with right-wing authoritarian governments in office. There was a paradigm shift for the left in terms of, to put it in form of an anecdote, in those years, the left used to say, Yankees go home, but with the human rights policies of the Carter administration, some of them began to say, Yankees come home. And that had effects, had tremendous effects. On the one hand, in terms of saving lives and putting pressure two ways, directly through diplomatic action, unilateral action on the part of US foreign policy on those regimes, but also through the Inter-American system of human rights. Those were, well, Santiago, you're better qualified than me to speak about, but those were the golden days of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. Golden days in terms of its capacity to be active and to be heard, and to get to organize these coalitions, transnational coalitions, if you want, and with different sectors of society, political parties or civil society and human rights movements. That is the beginning of the creation in Latin America of the human rights as a movement. And that was, in fact, towards the end of the 70s and 80s, the driver of democratic transition, which is interesting because that opened up a series of important intellectual questions, of course political, but also intellectual questions regarding the status of our discussion in Latin America about liberal constitutionalism. Because it was like a discovery, not even a rediscovery. Well, a rediscovery if you go back to the 19th century when Latin America was presumably liberal in the sense of having the institutions of liberalism in place in the form of restricted democracies and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, well, democracy wasn't much more inclusive anywhere else at the time anyway. But there was a sort of a suspension of this, you know, the liberal constitutional tradition got suspended largely because in Latin America, liberalism as such got a bad reputation for a number of reasons. The human rights policies of the Carter administration, the reinvigoration of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, a new international agenda forced the Latin American political societies, but particularly the left, to rethink the old issues of liberal constitutionalism. Basically, the idea that individuals have basic rights which can only be protected if public power is limited ex ante and divided. In other words, the constitutional state, separation of power, checks and balances, and for the protection of inalienable rights that individuals have. If you don't have that, you cannot enforce human rights, which is a more sophisticated and advanced notion that is rooted directly on those principles of liberal constitutionalism. And that was an interesting, if nothing else, intellectual detour in Latin America that contributed a great deal to the democratic transition and to the more or less consolidation is a word that I particularly don't like, but the field uses it, you know, if you want, with big quotation marks, the consolidation of democratic institutions. And the creation, it was important for the left to, at the time, when you go through the 80s and 90s, abandon all strategies of power taking, all strategies meaning violent action in their pursuit of power, adopting the strategies and the methods of democratic competition, and accepting the fundamentals through human rights, through largely the fact that most of the dissidents were left-wing people, through human rights embrace some of the fundamental principles of liberal constitutionalism, and therefore bring to the center, much to the center, the political debate, and be able to construct democratic institutions and hopefully consolidate them. Well, that's the story, if I may, until the commodity boom. Fast forward, that's the story because the commodity boom encountered governments in office and gave governments in office at the time, and I'm talking about 2003, 4 and on, with unprecedented resources. Latin America, for the most part, has enjoyed until very recently terms of trade that were unique in history. And that gave governments enormous amount of fiscal resources that they used for political projects, resources in the hands of the state. Many political projects which were based on perpetuation in office. This is something that has been yesterday discussed in the Latin American session. It's a recurrent issue that today, this morning, it was addressed again. The problem of perpetuation in office, constitutional redesigns and the elimination of term limits and different mechanisms for presidents to stay in office longer than they were expected to stay. And that entails, to some degree, as the conference poses it, some degree of important decline in human rights. In a very peculiar sense, true, dissidents are not thrown out of airplanes anymore, if you allow me to put it brutally, compared to the way dissidents were treated back in the old days of military dictatorships. But dissidents are intimidated. There is no torture in the way it was in those days of massive human rights violations, but there is intimidation of journalists. Why? Well, because the project of perpetuation in office requires some degree of compliance, and independent journalists and critics are not functional to those goals of perpetuation in office. And that confronts us, forces us to confront a very peculiar and uncomfortable situation, which is, on the one hand, to recognize that we have different issues in terms of human rights. We don't have to worry about torture in the way the region had to worry back in the 70s and 80s. We had to confront intimidation of journalists, and much more than intimidation, but let's put it that way, 2 minutes. But that forces us to sort of recognize a new generation of human rights issues on the agenda, but at the same time to value them, to give them a hierarchy, to be able to coexist, well, to not be able to coexist with torture, but are we able to coexist with the intimidation of journalists, which is a million times better than torturing people. But to put it in those terms, from a perspective of human rights principles and human rights doctrine, is extremely uncomfortable for no other reason than, well, human rights are human rights. And when you start grading human rights, when you start giving them a hierarchy, well, sooner than you know, you become very complacent with human rights violations that may not be as terrible as others we had in the past, but nonetheless may open the way for others like the ones we had in the past. And so the agenda is in a sort of in an impasse, in a transition, in terms of leaving that old brutality towards more subtle forms of political manipulation, control, and human rights violation, and how to fine-tune the agenda, the message, and the political strategies in order to confront this, while at the same time revitalizing the old principles of constitutional democracy, checks and balances, separation of power, and without which you cannot truly have an enforcement of the human rights agenda. Thank you, Santiago.
Thank you very much, Hector. I will ask now Mr. Rafendi to make his remarks. Okay. You can come here if you want.
All right, no, just here.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Anton Santiago, for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here in front of the presidents and prime ministers of COP de la Madrid. But at the same time, I feel a bit awkward as human rights activist sitting here in the panel. Since yesterday, I noticed there's no gender balance in the panels. They're all male. We are all male. That's a bit uncomfortable feelings I have.
Yep.
I have to acknowledge. Yes, thank you for that. Wow, it's not to be applause, but to be, how do you call that? All right, some self-criticisms. My job is actually continuing what has been said by Hector, story, and how human rights and foreign policies in my own context. My own context is Indonesia, 250 million people, among the region of 650 million people, and the sub-region of Asia Pacific. It's called Southeast Asia, right? Excluding East Timor. East Timor is a candidate of the ASEAN. So human rights and foreign policy from Indonesia perspective was actually very much related with the authoritarian regime that violates human rights. 30 years of violations. So my activism was also started after my student times. And I noticed the beginning of human rights as a foreign policy is a defense mechanisms as a country being targeted of human rights violators, because we are the occupiers of Timor-Leste. We become the target, Indonesia becomes the target, and as human rights activists from Indonesia, we use that kind of situation to also making sound that the problem is not only Timor-Leste, the problem is Indonesia, right? But that is the beginning back in year 90 after the Dili massacre, when the massacre was very much blow up. There was no YouTube at that time yet, but that's enough to really make the things big, and Indonesia become a big attention of all over the world. Indonesia then created national human rights institutions in response to the defense. It was Suharto who created national human rights institution. Of course, first presidential decree appointed, right? But they did a good job in the beginning because they will have to prove that they are serious in terms of human rights. So systematically, the Foreign Affairs Office, of course, then collecting knowledge as well, expertise on human rights and foreign policies. So at that time, my position was I was the enemy of the state because I'm the NGO criticizing my government. But when it comes to, at that year, 1993, that was the time where particularities and universalities were debated and settled in the Vienna Declaration of Human Rights. So that's a very monumental process. That reaffirmation, that contextuality of the region should not become barriers to implement human rights, and at the end of the day, respect to the international human rights standards that are accepted by all members should be upheld. That's settled, sounds settled. Even ASEAN at that time made for the first time, I was only 5 ministers at that time, make a communique that they are going to create a regional human rights mechanism in ASEAN back in 1993. So you see, that's Indonesia, still under authoritarian regime. There was a Vienna Declarations, reaffirmation of member states on human rights after 1948. So my other year, which is very important for the process of this human rights and foreign policy, is 1998. Why 1998? That was the fall of this authoritarian military regime, Suharto. It was 1998 that started everything into a very progressive process of how human rights translated in foreign policy. It's not only at the national level, it is at the regional level. Because then, by that time, ASEAN was already 10 member countries. The new members came, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam. And you can imagine what kind of countries they are. They are countries, communist countries, 2 communist countries, Laos and one is a junta militaire from Myanmar. And then the other one is Cambodia, coming up from the process of reconciliation after the genocide. So when the 10 countries were there, 2000s becoming very important, where Indonesia announced that cooperations of the ASEAN member state, the 10 member state, is not only an economic cooperation, it's not only on security in terms of keeping peace in the region, no war among the state, but political cooperations becoming an issue. What are the elements of political cooperations? Human rights is one of the elements. That was translated into the policy of Indonesian government into ASEAN by creating the so-called action plan on political cooperation, in the context of ASEAN. So the discussion of human rights started there as well, to create, to continue what has been stated publicly in 1993. So it took about almost 15 years, to go back again, for the 10 member states to really discuss that. So 2000 was in the action plan, and 2008, there's another number, 1998 and 2008, the Charter of ASEAN was adopted, was created. The charter is not a human rights charter, but it is a charter of this 10 member state that make ASEAN has a legal identity and has a principles of cooperations. And what are among the principles? Of course, what else? Human rights, good governance, rule of law, respect to fundamental rights and freedoms. That was in the charter. And it is in the discussion of the charter, Article 14 instructs the foreign ministers to create mechanisms in ASEAN, the so-called ASEAN Human Rights Body at that time. There was no name because there was no consensus about what would be the name of that body, all right? So after the charter was adopted, ratified by 10 member countries, then the TOR, we don't have the Convention of Human Rights like Europe. Europe was started with the Convention of Human Rights. We don't have the convention. That's why we start with the body first. We start with the C first, Commission. So this commission was based on the charter and then the TOR in terms of mandate and function, all right? So these are the things which is developing until now, 2009, until 2011. Why Indonesian government decided to put me? I am not a diplomat. I am not trained as a diplomat. I'm since the beginning a human rights activist. Because the Indonesian government believe to make change in the ASEAN context, to bring along, to engage member states, others, then you need to have somebody who can talk about what human rights is with other member states. So I was then, through the process of an open selection at the national level, then appointed by the minister. So officially, I am representing my government, right? I have to negotiate on behalf of my government, but I have the impartiality and the independence as human rights experts. So that is, I think, the good mindset and the good thought of my government at that time, led by the SBY period, and the Ministry of Virayuda, who's actually appointed me. So since then, I think the civil society campaign, advocacy to create credible regional human rights mechanisms was actually then translated as well into a direct participations of one member of civil society in the Intergovernmental Commission's negotiations. So that is something very unique. I think it has never happened in other contexts. Even in the European context, do you appoint somebody from the non-government organizations to represent the interests of the state, right? But this is human rights, of course. That's why it's different nature. So one thing that I have to say as well, before I close, short, that there is a difference, of course, between the role in the regional level, national level, and the global level. At the global level, I think Indonesia is still searching the identity, how to play a role. Because then you are most of the time trapped in the traditional politicizations in the council. You have the Asia group, non-aligned group, OIC group, right? And in the General Assembly, there is more or less in the same non-alignment movement, Asia group, and South and North, but trying to identify something. One thing which is cross-regional, I think, is the support of the resolution on the creation of one mechanisms on the Special Rapporteur on freedom of assembly. That is the cross-regional. That is, I think, one of the examples that human rights policy is really going to be translated at the global level and a regional level. What about the current government? We will still have wait and see. Because this current government, the new one, is very much nationalistic in its nature because of I don't know because of what, but their interest is actually trying to make, to put the national interest in the forefront before thinking about the role of supporting democracy in that part of the world. I end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafendi. I'll ask now Mr. Boldvik, please come to the podium.
Yeah, I think in order to make a change, I prefer to stand up by giving my introductory remarks. My point of entry will be, as already mentioned by the moderator, the UN Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, which we know starts in Article 1 by saying all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Remember, dignity before rights. That's interesting. And this is the basis for all our efforts for human rights and democracy. We should talk about democracy, human rights, and foreign policy today. And we know that very often we talk about foreign policy based on interests, an interest-based foreign policy, taking care of our country's interests. Of course, that is obvious that we have to do that, but I am more in favor of talking about a value-based foreign policy, taking care of mankind by means as democracy and human rights. So human rights and democracy should not be a special field of our foreign policy, a special interest, a special part of our foreign policy. Democracy and human rights must be an integral part of all foreign policy. And that's crucial for me. Because I'm also more and more convinced that democracy and respect for human rights is a precondition for lasting peace. Because abuses of human rights and authoritarian and totalitarian regimes will sooner or later lead to uprising, to revolt, and possible violent conflicts. Another important point is that democracy and human rights are interlinked. There is no real democracy without respect for the fundamental human rights. And the best, and in the longer perspective, the only possible framework for respect for human rights is democracy. They are interlinked. I will point to some challenges of our work for human rights and democracy for the time being. First, the disconnect between human rights as international discourse and political praxis. And there are at least two facets of this disconnect. One is between the discourse of the UN, Western governments, and academics, on the one hand, and the experienced reality, as we see it with political dissidents, human rights activists, and ethnic minorities in oppressive states. There is a disconnect. The other facet of a disconnect is between discourse and praxis in several countries. Countries that can be good at rehearsing human rights discourse, but in fact is practicing human rights violations. Universality of human rights is fundamentally about correspondence between discourse and praxis. And therefore we need also effective and credible assessment tools of implementation of human rights. We have established some. The UN Commission on Human Rights was replaced in 2006 by the UN Human Rights Council, placed in Geneva. And I think all of us had, and we still have, high expectations to that new body. But still it remains to see whether the Council special mechanism of the so-called Universal Periodic Review will contribute to a better implementation of human rights in all member countries. Another body is the International Criminal Court, also a rather new one. And that may also be an important step for implementation of human rights. But still it remains to see if this body will be efficient. We know that several cases are taken up in the court, but not concluded yet. Another challenge I will point to is the problem of double standards in foreign policy. It may be argued, since I'm asked to see this from a European point of view as well, it may be argued that both Europe and the US have lost credibility as promoters of freedom, human rights and democracy. And we know arguments used for that from other parts of the world. The plight of the Palestinians, hesitations of Western governments to confront political allies in other regions with their human rights violations, human rights violations in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, and so on. You have to be aware of that this is used as examples of double standards from the Western world. To be consistent in promoting human rights should mean no double standards. And we have to seriously go through our own praxis in the Western world. Another example is, of course, how are we so eager to avoid some countries to have nuclear weapons, but we look through our fingers with other countries getting nuclear weapons. That's another dilemma. And some will say this is a double standard. I will also point to a dilemma in promoting human rights and democracy, and that is that sometimes there are conflicting interests between reconciliation and peace on the one side and implementing human rights and democracy on the others. This is a real dilemma. And sometimes it requires compromises, as we saw it in the northern Uganda, we saw it to some extent in some Balkan countries, and so on. I think it's also so important as a point of entry for this discussion to emphasize that human rights standards is universal values. It's not regional values. We cannot talk about an Asian approach to human rights or an European approach to human rights. These are universal values. Because almost every member countries of the UN have signed all the main conventions of human rights, which were a follow-up of the declaration from '48. Let me end up by pointing to some special means for promoting human rights and democracy in our foreign policy. On regional basis in Europe, we have some organizations and mechanisms. We have the OSCE, which also deals with human rights and democracy issues. We have the Council of Europe, which is doing the same to some extent, and of course we have the European Union. From a Norwegian perspective, I can also mention that an integral part of our foreign policy is to have organized human rights dialogues with some countries as part of a broader cooperation. It's not a good idea to come to another country and say, now we sit down and have an organized human rights dialogue. It must be an integral part of a broader cooperation. We had it with China, for instance, but of obvious reasons, the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, that dialogue was stopped, and the relations are in fact frozen. That's a very interesting case. I cannot say more about that now. Another means for working for human rights and democracy from the Norwegian side, and also from several other countries, of course, is democracy assistance projects run by several NGOs. And as founder and president of the Oslo Center, we are involved in such democracy assistance projects as partner with other bigger international democracy organizations, and it is supported both politically and economically by the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs. So let me end up by pointing to some experiences and challenges we have met in this work for democracy and human rights. We have really experienced the challenge of ethnic conflicts, which very often complicate the work for human rights and democracy. We have met the challenge of strong religious tensions in some countries, which is another challenge for human rights and democracy. We have met, of course, the problem of inequality between men and women in participation in public life and political life. And last but not least, we have met the challenge of a lack of culture of dialogue in several countries, where they are more used to confrontation, and sometimes violent as well, and not of dialogue. So my main experience is that human rights and democracy is first and foremost a question of a way of thinking. It's a question of culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I did.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much. Right, foreign policy and democracy and human rights. Let me start by saying I may be a little bit politically incorrect, so please excuse me. And by that I mean I'm going to be frank, okay? We need that frank discussion, I guess. I guess we mean by foreign policy here the foreign policy of the industrialized, developed Western country, frankly. Again, we are not interested, I guess, in the foreign policy of Namibia or Togo, correct? Because they don't matter, frankly. It is the industrialized Western countries which set up themselves as the custodian of human rights, and they're the guys who sometimes go and invade countries and bomb, and, you know, Namibia will never go to Afghanistan or change things in Serbia or whatever. So let us home on the issue and discussion here, which the foreign policy of the West, because you are the custodian, or they claim to be the custodian of democracy and human rights, and because you are guys who are most active around the world, really. The guys who matters when these things happen. There is a serious charge laid against us, and I say us because I'm also British. I'm not only African, I'm also British, so I'm going to talk today as a British. Unfortunately, I'm also Sudanese. I say unfortunately because I cannot speak about Sudan, because you cannot put the word Sudan, democracy, human rights in one sentence. You cannot do that, because Sudan is run by a bunch of criminals, but that's something for Sadiq al-Mahdi to speak about. There is a charge against us that really human rights and democracy, in many cases, are used as a political weapon, selectively against the guys whom we don't like. And this is a serious charge. People need to think about that. Human rights matters in China, in Iran, in Russia, etc. It doesn't matter in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, in Hungary, and in places which we assume, or Israel, places we assume are our friends. Those guys get scot-free. And that raises an issue about, are you guys really genuine? Are you genuine, really? So we are not consistent. And we really need to look at that carefully. To be credible, we need to be consistent. And I told you stole half my speech, Prime Minister, so I'm not lingering on that because you were honest enough and politically incorrect enough to mention that, which is great. But Norwegians are always unusual. Let's look at an issue like Occupy the Square phenomena. There's a new phenomena here, Occupy the Square. This Occupy Square is very interesting. How much is it a democratic expression of the population dissatisfaction of whatever regime they have? How far it can go? Denying public space to other citizens, business or government, etc., for a day, for two, for a week, for a month, where it is tolerable and when it becomes intolerable, and how we deal with that. We have uploaded Occupy the Squares in Tahrir, in Taksim, and in Medan. But yet, very interestingly, when we had Occupy Wall Street in our own cities, unfortunately, we did not tolerate them. And that is very interesting. I was in London, and those bunch of people who don't like Wall Street, actually complain about inequality, decided to occupy St. Paul's, the area in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. Few days, and then the police forcibly moved them out, attacked them. And people said, excuse me, you're at the same time, you are supporting Taksim, supporting Medan, but when it's in London, why aren't you allowing those guys? Very interesting, the police said, we had complaint from St. Paul's Church that they are obstructing the route of the tourists. Tourists want to come into St. Paul, cannot come because of those guys in front of him. That's the time when the leaders of the church in UK were talking about inequality and blah, blah, blah. So actually, there was a route in the middle of those people to the church. So they were not stopping American tourists going to St. Paul's. But now there is a question. We have some guys sitting in Hong Kong obstructing the highway and government building. So if the Hong Kong police go and evacuate those guys, is that legal or not legal? Is that an action against democracy, as we claim, or not? I think we need to be consistent. I really ask a question and say, what is it? You guys need to be consistent. It is not just fine to attack the Turks or the Egyptians or whoever, or Ukrainian, and then in our city you are doing the same. And why it is good? What I'm saying here, I think for a clear level playing field and consistency, then we are genuine, then people listen to what we say. Otherwise, people are just laugh at us. I mean, take Hong Kong and democracy in Hong Kong. Britain managed the country for 150 or 200 years. Where was democracy? Once they left, where is the election? Where is the freedom of the people? Excuse me, and ask Chris Patten is a friend of mine, very nice guy, but he was the last governor of Hong Kong. I said, Chris, were you elected by the Hong Kong people? No. So why are you writing now in the FT, attacking the Hong Kong guys, I mean, the Chinese guys for going against. Really, what we need to be consistent. We not just suddenly discover we're in love with democracy after we hand over Hong Kong. Then we are not credible. This is a problem. So I think we really need to be genuine and consistent in what we do about this Occupy the street movement. Or we need to understand, actually, I want to understand where democracy starts, where democracy stops. Yeah, we need to understand that. And I have full sympathy with those young guys going to the street, but how far? How is regime change part of that process? If you're a country of 40 million people, 1 million people go and sit in a square, is regime change then legitimate or not legitimate? I think we need some discussion and to understand this. I have no position, but it just worries me we don't have a clear understanding of what of that process. Again, how we formulate things. I mean, we had that terrible incident, tragic, of shooting down the Malaysian airline in over Ukraine, which apparently shot down by the ragtag, the rebels or whatever you call them of East Ukraine, and very tragic incident, and immediately calls we need to sanction Russia and apply more sanctions because supplied weapons here, and how it is tragedy, but clearly it's a mistake. Nobody in their right mind is shooting down a plane. And it reminds me, some years ago, that the American Navy actually shot an Iranian civilian airplane flying in the Iranian aerospace and refused even to apologize. And the trigger-happy captain of this later on was promoted, and when the charge was honored and got a medal. So nobody asked for sanctions against America. People say, "Oh, it's a mistake." And so, are we genuine here? Why, when ragtag of, guerrillas or whatever shoot an airplane by mistake, we ask for sanctions here? When a regular army, well trained with all tools and kit, does the same, it's a mistake, and it's fine. We just turn the leaf. I think there is an issue of consistency, and that raises an issue of credibility. Final point I wish to make is we talked about 48 and declarations and God knows what, etc. We have a major problem with all our international institutions. Let's start with the United Nations. We all know the United Nations, we have the General Assembly, we have Security Council. General Assembly really is a talking shop, yes? It's just a talking shop. All the powers is with Security Council. Look at the Security Council. 2%, less than 2% of the population, Britain and France, have 40% of the voting power and the staying power, permanent seats in that Security Council. Is that democratic? Is that democratic? And people realize that, and nothing is done about it. This is our global governance system, which is non-democratic. What are we doing about it? Are we reforming it? Are we even discussing it? No. The powers that be, which took over control after the Second World War, pretend that nothing changed, and they want still to have that control. Look at the World Bank and the IMF. We always had to have a European, for that, say, French president of the IMF. Why, I don't know. All this 7 billion population cannot produce somebody smart enough to run the IMF, or an American running the World Bank. The voting rights in the IMF, the American Congress refused to let power over that. So these institutions are crumbling because they are losing legitimacy. So what happens? Chinese are starting other development banks in China, with the BRICS developing other, and the whole order around us is crumbling. Why? Because we never want to let go of whatever power they acquired 60 years ago or 70 years ago, and we assume that nothing has changed when everything around us has changed. So what I'm asking you, ladies and gentlemen from Europe, and please wake up and just be credible. And the world around us changed. You need to change too, and you need to be more genuine if you want the people to trust you and believe you. Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much. Excellent presentations. I believe we have 15 minutes for question and answers. Someone from the Club de Madrid here, 15 minutes? Yeah? Okay. Let me just take one issue that was raised during the presentations, which is the disconnect between the discourse and the practice expressed by Prime Minister Bondevik. And Mo Ibrahim referred to, are we genuine here? My experience shows that there is a big gap between the discourse of the governments when they get together to discuss human rights and the practice of the governments right after they leave those discussions about human rights. So part of the issue here, which I think needs to be addressed, and hopefully we can get into that with the question and answers, is two things. Why is that? Why is that big gap between the discourse and the reality? A lot goes to the idea of being frank, as Mo Ibrahim was saying. And what can we do to change that? I mean, that's at the heart of the defense of human rights. How can we make the practice of the governments bridge the gap between the discourse and the practice? So let me take some questions now. Again, we have 15 minutes. Please. And please, can you address to whoever you are asking the question, or to everybody?
Thank you very much. I am very much impressed by the performance of the panelists on the issues. I think that as Club of Madrid, we have got to make value added in this debate. I think there is needed reform in order to remove the inconsistency and also to address the grievances. One, we have to speak specifically about the reform of the United Nations system, in which case also we have to elevate the contribution of non-governmental societies as a people's parliament in the United Nations. Also, we must recognize the fact that the present Human Rights Council in Geneva is a lame duck. It judges over people in which themselves are really deficient in human rights. I think we should develop it into some form of human rights court, because as it functions today, it simply glosses over the issues. It does not address them. This is another matter that I think we should address. Finally, I think that the matters concerning the future require us also to revise the Human Rights Charter, because now one of the most important new aspects is the aspect of the environment. We have got to address the fact that now there is climate injustice, because the polluters are getting free and the victims are suffering. I think we should add this matter, that is to say, the environment as an issue of human rights, because it does concern the human ecology and the future of humanity. I think this, again, should be added, and also there should be some kind of accountability. Otherwise, the greater and the powerful will get away with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't think there is any specific questions. I will take more questions from the audience. Ted, please.
Ted Picome from Brookings. Can you hear me? I agree with much of what was said on the panel. Thank you for it. But I want to come back to the point you made, Prime Minister Bondevik, about the disconnect between many different levels, but one in particular between values and interests in foreign policy. I think as foreign policy practitioners, as many of you know, a state always has to protect its interests. Values will always lose in that battle if we put interests and values on a separate part of the scale. We need to merge interests and values. We need to understand the value and the importance in our own self-interest to promote democracy and human rights in other countries. We see reduced conflict. We see empowerment of all citizens. We see much better development outcomes in democracies. We don't see famines. We don't see war. That has to be incorporated into our interest-based foreign policy, merging those two. Another point is on the double standards issue, which I think was so important. I agree that there are many, many double standards and inconsistencies. So democracies need to get their act together and practice what they preach and lead by example. And that is a major problem in the United States and in other countries. So I agree with that. But there is no, in the current framework, a really dispassionate, independent critic. The UN is one possibility, and I think the Universal Periodic Review has some elements of that everyone has bought into, and so could provide the seeds of something that is less inconsistent, is probably the best way of putting it. Those are my two main points. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Yes, please. And then we'll go to the, yeah.
Mr. Mike.
Philip Dimitrov, former Prime Minister of Bulgaria. The problem was set as a discrepancy between the discourse and the practice, and this has been confirmed by many. We have heard a lot of statements how the practice has to be changed because there is something wrong with the practice. Is it possible that there is something wrong in the discourse? I remember a gentleman called Winston Churchill, whose discourse was a little bit different. Was he a Democrat or not?
Thank you. Let me go to the panelists. Each of you, if you want to answer something, Mr. Bondevik, then we'll go to Hector.
First to my good colleague, in Club de Madrid, Sadiq Al-Mari. I do agree that we need a reform of the UN system to live up to the current expectations of human rights and democracy. And of course, especially the composition of the Security Council in itself. It's unfair, of course. It was established after the Second World War. It's not living up to the challenges of today, that Africa and Latin America has no permanent member of the Security Council. Of course, it's out of order with today's situation. But of course, it's so difficult to change it. We know it all. Some of us have tried. Because the current permanent members have a veto also in that regard. So it's impossible. It seems impossible. I'm a little bit more optimistic with regard to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. It's rather promising. And the Universal Periodic Review mechanism is, to some extent, functioning rather well. There are some good results of that, coming back to the same countries after a period and bringing up on the table what have you done since the last report. And it's not comfortable for some countries. And we have seen some tendencies of changes in that's right. I do agree also that it's so important to try to combine a value-based and interest-based foreign policy to convince more countries that it is in your own interest, in the longer perspective at least, that you base your foreign policy on universal values like human rights. And so we should not set them up against each other, but see how we can combine it. I think I stop with that. Maybe others will comment on other questions.
I'd like to follow up on Ted Picone's point If I were to sort of use a metaphor, I'd like to celebrate inconsistency, if I may. Because this is about power, and the intervening variable here is power and state power, which by definition is asymmetrical. And so the task in terms of human rights, and if you want a sort of a human rights realist approach, is, well, how much reform, how much you can carve out of a power structure that is asymmetrical. These are states. It's asymmetrically distributed, their power, and that's what they maximize. Because the option of consistency, well, there is consistency in China, and in Cuba, there is a single-party rule, and the interest of the states is paramount, and there are no human rights spaces possible in those situations. So we have to operate with this inconsistency of this place we call the West, with quotation marks, which is dramatically characterized by this inconsistency, and see how much we can do, as we did in piecemeal fashion, how much we could carve out of this power inconsistency to advance the agenda of human rights. And so I would stop there.
Thank you.
Is this working? Yeah. I just want to comment on the Prime Minister's words here. I don't think that doing nothing about UN and international organization is an option. Because what will happen if we do nothing? They will erode. They will just erode. Other organizations will start to come up regional. People will start to give up on them. And people need to hold everybody hands to the fire. I speak to the Americans, they say, yeah, we are all for a change. We need to expand it maybe to 12 or, depends whom you speak to in the administration. Or maybe actually we can have a smaller one and maybe Britain or France, one of them get out, or just one seat for Europe, or etc. You speak to the French and the British, say, no, we stay there, but we expand it. We don't want to go. So everybody agrees it needs reform, but they just talk and make sure nothing happens because they're happy what is there. That should be an urgent matter because the Security Council is losing its legitimacy. It's just losing its legitimacy. And people have to do something because that's the most valuable thing we have as human beings living together on this earth and trying to figure how on earth can we coexist, is to have this international governance, which is the United Nations. We don't want to lose it. So people need to act on that. Your voices must rise and let us sort it out. And the option, and then look at the others. I mean, okay, the issues on finance, economy, people started this G kind of meetings. And G6 then became G8, became G8 minus 1, and then became G12, and then 20, G20, then G. And I always ask, who decides? Who decides you are a member of the G20, you are a member of G8, you are not a member? Who is doing that? Do you know? Anybody here knows? Please tell me no. How we are running this world around us. So we need a little bit more transparency, more better, because before we open our mouths and talk about democracy and liberalism, etc., we need to practice and we show we are practicing it. Otherwise, we are not genuine. That's what's here.
We have one more. Frank, you have a question? Okay, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. We were talking about issues of consistency in terms of policy and human rights, and there's two issues I'd like to raise in here, the panelists. Number one is that if there is going to be sort of international criticism from regional bodies or the UN or other bodies, there also has to be internal criticism. And one of the things I find that we have been mentioning here is that there's less and less patience of governments with their own human rights defenders and human rights NGOs or with the press. And there's more sense of curtailing the press, investigative journalism that challenges them on human rights or corruption or with human rights organizations. This is important, how to make governments consistent with what democracy is all about, which is an open debate internally. And the second inconsistency is we have been mentioning how the the political model of democracy did not solve the economic quest for improvement of our people, our nations. And this is a contradiction that may challenge democracy. But if we had a really human rights focus, every government and every state would have policies that would integrate civil and political rights with economic and social rights, and would actually make it very relevant to integrate both a political agenda for civil, political rights and participation with an economic agenda of satisfying at least the basic needs. How can we build this consistency from a truly human rights perspective?
Thank you, Frank. I don't think it's really a question, but I don't know if anybody on the panel wants. Yep.
Yeah. I fully agree with you with regard to the importance of allowing internal criticism. As former politicians, of course, we knew that it was not the most, we didn't appreciate so much when we got criticism from inside about how we implemented the human rights in our own countries. But of course, we needed it. And it's so important, and that we allow this to take place. And that is a really problem in several countries now, that they try to crack down those individuals and organizations that are criticizing the practice of human rights domestically. I do agree also what you said about economic, social rights on the one hand and political and civil rights on the one hand. And that reminds us about the two main UN conventions about human rights is one on political and civil rights and one on economic and social rights. And both, they are equally important. They are equally important. And that is so, especially for us in the West, it's crucial to remind ourselves about that, especially when we meet people from developing countries. Because again, we sometimes are accused of double standards. We are only talking about the political and civil rights and not about the economic and social rights. And they are equally important. My colleague Dimitrov, you had a very important question. Is there, when there is a disconnection between discourse and praxis, could it be something wrong with the discourse? Well, of course, it's an interesting discussion, but as far as we talk about the UN Declaration of Human Rights and all the main conventions which are following up of the declaration, I will say the discourse is good and it is universally accepted and adopted. So I think what is the challenge is to bring the praxis in accordance with the discourse. That is a challenge for me.
I agree. Rafende.
Just last remarks on the disconnectivity of value or discourses. I think you mean discourses of values that are accepted in the praxis. And the value added of the club, the Madrid, I think the value added will be based on the wisdom and expertise of this club, intervene in the elements that blocks this disconnectivity. The participation could be, the UN Council, they have panels. Every session, they have a series of panels on different issues. Some of the panels might be strategic in terms of addressing this connectivity on the issue of, for example, double standard. Double standard in terms of rights, double standard in terms of country, addressing the politicization of the council that actually eroding the values itself. So then, Club de la Madrid can play a role to remind them that the values should always be upheld, to find really a solution when things getting too politicized. A very good example, for example, the concept of human rights-based approach has been challenged seriously in the UN Council on the draft resolutions of technical assistance, technical cooperations on human rights. It is so politicized. And then cooperations with the new emerging power I think that's also the key, to really engage in the dialogue. So I want to go along with it. Dialogue is one of the instruments. So Club de la Madrid can also participate in the dialogue of human rights in all bilateral, especially targeting the new emerging force who would like to translate the policy into human rights.
Thank you, Rafendi. I think we are running out of time. Is there any announcement that we need to make before we close? Okay, no? Great. Please, join me in thanking all the panelists for this presentation, and thank you very much.